Okay, good morning. It's 9:45, might as well get started. My name is Marty Pomper, and I'll be discussing no science, really, but I'll sort of be discussing the science of giving a talk. So you could tell already by the title that I lowered expectations a little, but I wouldn't recommend that. Actually, you should have a very captivating title as your first slide. So first, I want to emphasize how important that public speaking really is. So number one, communication, according to articles that I read on the topic, is the most important capability of an executive next to that executive being able to maintain the bottom line at their company. So all of you in science, whether you like to think so or not, you're executives. Okay, you are basically running your own little operation, and you've got to be able to communicate, either with people that work with you, work for you, or your bosses. You should understand that when you're speaking in public, this is a rare opportunity, and I always consider it an honor to be able to speak because you've got people's attention all at the same time. You're the boss. It's your show, at least until the question and answer session comes, and we'll talk about how to manage that too. Okay, also, it's a rare opportunity to excel. So, for example, and I want to emphasize this particularly in the case of junior people, because you get a big audience and you have a chance to make an impression that might last, for a long time. So, for example, there was a junior person in my group who was asked to give a little 5-minute summary right before some big shot was going to give the main talk. So she just gave a little talk, and then the big talk comes. So she said, I just got a little 5-minute thing. I'll just, show a couple slides. We'll see what happens. I said, no. Okay, so there's going to be standing room only for the big shot, and it was at her institution. So it was really a chance for her to excel. So she worked very hard, spent, a couple hours preparing a 5-minute talk. And ever since then, people go up to her and they congratulate her on it. They want to collaborate, etc. So very important, especially if you're junior. At my stage, I feel like I could say pretty much anything. It doesn't matter. But when you're getting started, it's important. So I'm going to talk about, I'll give a little bit of perspective, some historical perspective. Talk about some key points. Talk about the audience, the opening of the talk, the body of the talk, and also conclusions and Q&A, but those aren't my conclusions. Those are how you conclude and how you manage questions. Okay, so first in terms of a perspective. So here's a slide. It might be hard for you to read, but this is an example of a good speech. This is a fragment. Okay, you may not be able to read this very easily, but I'll read to you beginning with the word "the." So it says, "The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here." Does anybody recognize that? Yes, sir. Right, so that's the Gettysburg Address. Okay, so Abraham Lincoln wrote this when he, theoretically was on the train up to Gettysburg from Washington, D.C. But I show this as an example of a good speech because some consider it one of the finest pieces of public oratory ever presented in the English language. Okay, so it's probably not a bad example to start with. So why was this speech good? So I don't have the opening, but I had a very dramatic opening, 7 years ago, etc. Very dramatic. You want to have a nice opening like that. Key points. So he summarized the entire battle at Gettysburg, which was a big turning point in the war, in about 10 sentences. So he did that at the beginning of the talk, and then at the end he had a very dramatic ending. Spoke only about concepts and ideas. So on the previous slide, he said basically that they're not going to remember what we say here, but they're never going to forget what we do here. He doesn't say who they is. He doesn't give any details, but everyone knows what he's talking about. So concepts and ideas. You don't have to show lots of little details in your talk. And in fact, ironically, they say that although no one will forget what they did here, but they'll forget what we say here, everyone remembers what they said nobody remembers what actually happened, the details. So I think that shows how memorable this is. A couple of themes in a brief talk, and this was very succinct. This talk was just over 2 minutes, and it basically changed the way that public speaking occurred ever since that talk was given. Before that, speakers, politicians would give 2-hour talks. In fact, the talk before his was 2 hours long. It was well received. But the point is that changed the way the talks are given, and it's because it was general, and it was succinct, and it had impact. So here are some key points. Number one, you want to know your audience and respect the audience. Figure out basically who they are and what they want to get out of the talk. You need to focus on what is to be retained rather than on the amount of information that you're going to be providing. There's a tendency to want to pack lots of information in. So think of yourself as an educator, as a teacher when you're giving a talk. Be dynamic, enthusiastic, and it's also going to be a little bit nervous. Okay, if you're too comfortable or too glib, it also doesn't go very well. You want to be able to repeat important points 5 times. This, I've read a couple of articles which said that this is a good thing to do. This is how people remember. And in fact, this can sort of make you more comfortable or about the fact that no one can really steal your thunder. So the talk before you that has the same title as your talk, and this has happened to me, you worry, oh my God, what am I going to say? I mean, they're going to talk about everything, but you know, since people don't really pay attention that well anyway, it doesn't hurt to repeat things a little bit. In fact, they say 5 times. Analogies, anecdotes, and examples are extremely helpful for people in a brief talk. But probably the most important thing is just thoughtful preparation. Okay, so you have to prepare, and that shows respect for your audience when you're prepared. So some other important points. You have to demonstrate integrity. You've got to be candid. You've got to be consistent so that they trust you, so that they pay attention and believe what you're saying. You should also be an expert. No apologies, and I'll talk about some apologies that you've probably heard people make when they're giving a talk. Be visual. So slides, I mean, these are a lot of word slides, but you know, I show a couple examples of how to use sort of graphics. Respect people's time. So end your talk on time. Don't, you know, feel compelled to rush through your last 6 slides in the 5 or 8 minutes after you're done. Okay, so you got to respect people's time. Nobody pays attention to those last 5 or 6 slides, at least not in my experience. Be conversational and basically friendly. So you don't want to be confrontational. So the audience. So animate the audience and not the slides. There's a tendency with PowerPoint. I mean, you could use 90 different shades of color, and there's countless animations you could use. I think that people, frankly, are getting away from that a little bit because it's very distracting. So know who your audience is. I always am very careful to find out, you know, who exactly is going to come to this talk. What are they expecting to get from it? Is it going to be technical? Is it going to be non-technical? Is it going to be the garden club? Or is it going to be, you know, scientists? And, you know, there's a lot of different audiences. Okay, also rapport and interaction. So it's hard nowadays, in the days of PowerPoint, frankly, to have interaction. But when I first started giving talks, they were on overhead projector slides, or they were at the chalkboard. And, you know, the first few talks I gave, the professor would hand me a piece of chalk, which I would break in half so it wouldn't vibrate on the chalkboard. And I'd basically get up there and be able to interact in real time. It's hard to do real-time things now with PowerPoint, although there probably are ways you can do it. We tend to be conditioned to these 90-second sound bites, and according to research that I've read, that people have about a 20-minute attention span. So if you have a talk that's an hour long, you should probably break it into 3 20-minute talks. So this talk is about 40, 45 minutes, so I should probably try to, you know, break it down. Also, try to modulate your talk a little bit. Show some empathy for your audience. So there are many times where I'll be giving a talk and I think that this slide is totally clear, but I see the audience is like, what? What the heck's talking? So then I slow down. Of course, then you got to worry about not finishing on time, but you should try to modulate your talk a little bit. Don't just kind of breeze through it and do it for your own benefit. So the opening. So you want to dress slightly better than the audience. They suggest that you lean into the audience at the beginning of your talk so it shows you're engaged with them. These are all psychological things I was reading about. You should try to appeal to emotions as well as logic. So it turns out that impressions that people take away from a talk are only 7% from what you say, 38% from your tone, and 55% from your body language. Now, unfortunately, I have to kind of lean here to see the slides, so you don't get to see my normal body language. Not that that would help, probably hurt a little bit. But it's the reason that is, why is body language so important? It's because people can lie in their words. The tone of voice is a little bit harder to lie. And body language, unless you're trained to lie, unless you're like a politician or something, there's really no way you could lie with your body language. Okay, that takes a career to do that. Also, I like to orient myself with an introductory slide. So there's a slide I show. It has a little animation on it. I've been showing this slide since 2006, which is why molecular imaging, I guess, remains in the future. But I show this slide for me because I'm comfortable with it. It's familiar. I look at it. I know exactly what I'm going to say. I could probably do this if I were in a coma. So I show that slide because it orients myself and it gives me a little bit of confidence at the beginning of the talk. So the beginning is when people tend to get a little bit flustered. In fact, some recommend to memorize your opening statement. So here's a couple of apologies that you'll often hear. Totally unnecessary. Okay, one is people will say, well, I was asked to discuss image processing in photoacoustic imaging, but I don't really know much about this, so I'll do the best I can. I hope you guys are okay with it. You don't do that. So don't say that you're not an expert. When you're up there in front of everybody, there are a couple, like 100 or 100 and whatever man-hours of effort are going to go into just listening to this talk. So you don't want to say it. The other common one is, I know that this slide is actually rather busy, right? So if you know that, don't do it, right? Have a non-busy slide that everybody can look at. I'll show another apology later that you hear. Like they'll say, well, I really apologize. Those of you in the back aren't going to be able to see this. So why not have a slide where those in the back can see it? So anyway, it just shows a lack of respect, frankly, for the audience. So here's an example that I got from the internet. And I actually got this example because it's an example of how the U.S. military, so they specifically said one problem with the U.S. military is that they give very boring talks. And that's because all the slides kind of look like this. Okay, so you're going to start, counter ethnos. I mean, you don't even know where to begin looking at that. And you're certainly not going to be listening to the speaker. The other kind of busy slide that you want to avoid is this kind of thing. Okay, so people can't parallel process. So you can't be speaking and people can't be reading and they're not going to hear what you say, etc., if they're reading. Okay, so no matter how smart that you are, the human brain isn't set up to do that. So you should probably read your slides to a certain extent, unless they're very, very basic. This is about the most complicated slide that I show. And I always feel a little bit guilty when I show it because it requires some explanation. And this is about a 2-minute slide. Slides should last, maybe about 3/4 of a minute or so when people start getting bored looking at it. This is another busy slide. This is a busy one that I show. Actually, Dr. Hamoud is sitting up here, made this slide a long time ago for me. And what I sometimes do on a slide like this, where you want to be busy almost to drive a point home, is that you will encircle the thing that you want people to focus on. But to tell you the truth, that's no excuse for a busy slide. You probably shouldn't even do that, but that's another example. And then in terms of animation, so maybe if the technician here could click on that slide in the middle. So if you could just put the cursor on that and on this. So, and then on the one on the bottom, you just have to click on the whole thing. Or not. But this is about as animated as a slide gets. And this basically is illustrating a point of how you do coincidence detection, and PET scanning. Okay, that's, I think, enough in terms of animation. So tend not to have things bouncing around and bouncing in and that sort of thing. It's kind of hard to turn this thing. Okay, so stage fright, especially junior people when they're first getting started. What are the fears? Okay, number one is forgetting what to say. But if you've got a nice orienting slide at the beginning, or you've got the opening words of your talk memorized, that tends not to happen. It's also a lot harder to forget what to say these days when we use PowerPoint so much. So the slides can provide cues. So this is really kind of going away. Also, using humor and not being funny. That's also that's a fear people have. So if you're not naturally a humorous person, try to downplay the humor a little bit. But you can be risky that way. You can offend people. And I've been in talks where people do say surprisingly offensive things in public. So you want to try to avoid that. Exposing a weakness. So for example, one of the first talks that I gave was when I was in grad school. They have a course at University of Illinois, the chemistry department, called Chemistry 435. And that's where you give a seminar to the department. So all your professors are there, all your friends are there, your co-grad students, and they basically quiz you about something from the literature that you pick. But because you get to pick it, you're the boss. So I spent 6 solid weeks learning every possible aspect of that material for a 50-minute talk because I wanted to make a good impression on the department, because I did not want to expose too many weaknesses. Now, we all have them, and they get exposed from time to time, but shouldn't live in fear of that. Also, you don't really know how it's going to go once you're live. So I already had in my mind what I was going to say to this point in the talk an hour ago, and I already have not mentioned about a third of it, okay, because you just don't know how things are going to go once you're actually physically there. So that's also frightening. But the way that you confront stage fright, number one is always careful preparation. So when you take exams, I mean, I don't know about you, but when I would take an exam in college, if I prepared for it, I was glad to take it. I look forward to it. I would sit there, and while they're passing out the papers, if I was prepared, great. This is a chance to show what I know. But if I wasn't prepared, it's horrible. So same thing goes with giving lectures. You should also try to rehearse out loud in front of others, or out loud in front of a mirror. You should, do it out loud so you know what the timing is. The timing is very important. That's usually the second thing I ask. I ask, who's the audience and how long do you want me to talk for? And I think those are very important points. They say a slice of apple, water at room temperature, not ice water. They also say you shouldn't have coffee, which I probably shouldn't have, but no milk also, because it gets caught up in your throat. So you should, one article I read said that you should imagine a successful talk if you're afraid. So while you're walking up, you should imagine people clapping and having them, turning on their lighters and stuff, and whatever it is, so that you feel good about it. You want spontaneity to a certain extent. There's always going to be spontaneity, unless you have a whole talk memorized or you're reading from it, which I would never recommend. But you should probably know what you're going to say at the very opening. Okay, so in the body of the talk, if you're going to talk for more than 20 minutes, you should have little mini presentations. Show another slide that gives a break in the talk, and that way people will get recalibrated. People tend to look at the beginning of the talk, and then they'll look at the summary slide, and then they'll check their BlackBerry and whatever during most of the rest of the talk if it goes for more than 20 minutes. So few themes, lots of examples. It turns out that a third of lectures get negative feedback due to slides. So typos, abbreviations that no one knows about, the font being too small. So this is like a 36 font, I think. But typos, it's always a little irritating to me to see a typo. But, sometimes you can't help it. Sometimes I've had, very carefully prepared talk in front of an esteemed audience, and I look at my title slide has a word missing or something. So it happens sometimes. They recommend that you should have 1 point for each slide, 6 lines with 6 words per slide. So this has 4 lines, and some of these are a little bit longer. But I mean, there's all sorts of things. I mean, people have studied this and really made a science out of it, particularly in the era of PowerPoint. Okay, so also, you want to keep the same grammatical form of each line, not have a question here, a statement there, a sentence there. You want to use incomplete sentences without punctuation. That way you could focus on ideas rather than just spoon feed a sentence to somebody. You don't want to use fancy fonts. You don't want everything in bold or italics or uppercase. It's a little bit distracting, or underline. 1 to 2 minutes and maybe one main point per slide, as I mentioned before. They even talk about what colors to use. So white backgrounds, they supposedly show purity. Blue backgrounds are more serene. Red, you don't want to use red unless you're giving a lecture to trauma surgeons or something. So red is supposed to be frightening. And also, don't dread a slide or apologize for a slide. So what I mean by dread is that sometimes when you're giving a talk, you know that one slide is coming up that you're not that good at explaining. So just get rid of it. You're in charge. So for example, Henry Wagner, the late Henry Wagner, used to give this highlights lecture at the Society of Nuclear Medicine. And the last couple of years that he did that, I would sit with him and go over his slides. And he would start trying to explain the slide. And if he saw a quizzical look on my face and felt that he wasn't explaining it right, boom, that slide's gone. So that's what you have to do. You're in charge of all aspects of the talk. So some common mistakes. There's a desire to tell everything that you know about the topic because you worked so incredibly hard on this thing. You want to make sure the audience suffers as much as you did. So you want to say everything you can. Also, pausing in the wrong places. It's a little uncomfortable sometimes, you know, when people will do that. Too fast is not good. Too monotonous, so you try to be conversational when you're giving your talk. Not speaking clearly into the microphone, so sometimes, you know, people will be like this. And it'll seem like 10 minutes before they realize nobody could hear them. Okay, so try to speak into the microphone. Also, you can't expect people to parallel process, so they can only focus on one thing at a time. So in terms of questions and answers, how do you handle that? Let's see. Okay, so number one, you should really try to conclude on time. And that means that you should be mentally prepared to skip material, even the great, brilliant stuff that you've worked so hard to put together. A lot of times, and this has happened to me, where you'll sort of be a scapegoat for the other people in the session that weren't on time, right? So you're like the last talk right before lunch, and the previous 3 talks each went over 10 minutes, which cuts you into half. And it turns out that, you know, people are a lot more interested in lunch, usually, so the moderator will say, come on, get going. So you have to be ready to skip material. And if you don't have to skip material, you should make sure, again, I really want to emphasize that concluding on time. Make it easy to ask questions. So, you know, when you'll often hear people say, that's a really good question, I'm glad you asked that. And then you'll be in the audience and you wonder, that's a stupid question, right? But that's because the speaker is trying to, you know, get a little interest in the talk and try to make it easy for people so they don't feel intimidated to ask questions. Also, when you are asked a question, there's a tendency, because of the heat of the moment, to give a long, rambling, highly technical answer that should probably be discussed in the hallway, you know, after the meeting. You should also try to anticipate obvious questions or hostile questions, particularly when you go for an interview. So if you're being interviewed, it's a little bit different situation than giving a talk. But, you know, for some people, their talks are part of the interview. So you want to anticipate and have thought about what you're going to say for certain questions. You could even have a slide prepared that you'll show later on if somebody says, oh, I'm glad you asked that. But to tell you the truth, that gets a little bit fancy. And people don't like that. It's like, oh, he knew what I was going to ask. Huh, I thought I was smarter than that. And now he's showing me I'm not. So, you know, you want to make sure that you balance that out a little bit. You also don't want to be glib in your answers. So sometimes you will get a semi-hostile question, and I've gotten questions. I mean, it's, you know, what could be hostile in a scientific environment where we're all friends like this, right? Well, you know, sometimes there's a lot of passion, And people will say, that's a lie. You know, when I did that experiment, I got twice the signal to noise, right? So then you'll say, well, that's because, you know, you were using the wrong scanner. And, you know, so you try not to be too glib and try not to put anyone down. Never lose your temper. So there's another temptation is to lose your temper when somebody asks a hostile question. Also, sometimes it's good to call on people. And I actually do that, you know, even in venues like this, just to keep people on their toes. I'll find like some junior person that I know, usually not from my institution, and I'll just sort of call on them. And, you know, then they have to like put away their iPad and, can you repeat the question, please, right? But sometimes I do that. Or I'll leave the audience with a challenge. So I gave a talk a couple months ago at Stanford, and one of the things that we're interested in is having a good molecular genetic reporter system. We want to have a good reporter probe that actually works in human beings, not mice. So I put a challenge out, since there's, you know, this is what they do. I said, so come up with one, right? Engage them a little bit, so get them thinking, especially those junior guys who aren't in a rut like I am and can actually think of something creative and new. So I will summarize now. Number one, effective communication is necessary for success. You've got to be able to communicate. So you can get to a certain level in your career depending on your ambition. But if you're the kind of person that can't communicate well with other people, trust me, you're going to hit a ceiling, and that's going to be it. You can't be totally dictatorial and be able to succeed, at least not in this kind of an environment. Number two, you should care about your presentation and care about the audience. So as Benjamin Franklin said, fear to do ill, and you need fear naught else. So if you just try and do a nice job, you probably will. So just show some interest. I mean, you know, I've been sitting next to people in meetings that are putting together their talk while the previous speaker is giving their talk. And you probably don't want to do that because it's not going to come off very well. It's going to show lack of respect for the audience, who probably has a lot better things to do. Again, I want to emphasize just showing concepts and ideas. You don't have to have slides that have, you know, 6 different tables in them, and each table has, you know, 5 rows and 10 columns, and you can focus on concepts and ideas. Okay, now you can have, you know, depending on you know what sort of talk it is. If it's a talk to a small group of 5 or 6 people where you've got to go over hard data in detail, you know, it's a little bit different. But generally, we're talking about talks like this at a national, international meeting. Okay, so I find that few presentations are too basic or too brief. People tend to like to hear a lot of stuff of what they already know. And then you sort of build on that a little bit in your talk, and then it sort of seems like they learn a little bit better that way. So it's sort of, I think George Orwell even said in 1984 that people like to read exactly what they already know. So basic is generally pretty good. Also too brief. So we're going to finish early. I guess that's a shame. So you got an extra 15 minutes. What are you going to do with that time, right? Not many people say, wait a minute, you're not, you got another 15 minutes. But anyway, so you can't be too basic or too brief. Probably the most important thing, which I didn't discuss, because this isn't a scientific talk, is make sure that you've got interesting things to discuss so that the work that you're presenting is inherently interesting. So you don't have to show every last, high-performance liquid chromatograph that with every peak on it before you show the one with your optimized sample. Okay, if you're talking about a PET synthesis. So make sure that what you're discussing, each slide has a point and is going to be interesting. You also want to try to get feedback from the audience to a certain extent. And that way you'll incrementally get a little bit better, Usually you could sort of tell. And the audience is actually so important, and it depends like what country you're in. So some jokes that I'll tell will just fall flat in one place. Other places I'm not even trying to be funny and they think it's funny. So, you never know. But it's good to get feedback from the audience so you know what works next time. And the last thing is you should enjoy yourself. And, you know, if you're a little bit of a ham, like I am, it's fun. And it's fun to have an audience. And if you're well prepared, it's something that you actually sort of look forward to, you know, right before and during the process. So anyway, these are my extremely biased ideas about giving a talk, but I think it's a very important thing to do, especially for junior people. You should volunteer when you can to do it. In fact, when I was starting graduate school, I had a choice of either grading papers for general organic chemistry, or I could teach Chemistry 101, which was about 10 times more work because it required teaching 2 quiz sections, an hour apiece, 4 times a week, from 8 to 9 and 9 to 10. But I had to make all the lectures, and I had to grade all the papers, but it was great practice. So I was in my early 20s back then when I had a lot more energy. And I think that since you guys look like most of you are pretty young, I think it's good to, you know, get out there and don't be afraid of criticism. Anyway, so that's all I have to say. So enjoy your 10 minutes free. Thank you.